In the summer of 2002, I was between my freshman and my sophomore years of college, and I was also a staff sergeant in the Tennessee Air National Guard. There I am from that time period with my puppies Murdoch and Rico. And it being 2002, just a few months after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, security was more heightened than it had been in previous years. I remember a time when you could just simply drive onto an Air Force base without having to check a person's ID or show your identification. It was very easy to get on and off base until 9/11, then became much more serious. But back in 2002, during this time of heightened security, the call went out, hey, would anyone like to be a security forces augmentee? If so, we'll activate you, put you on orders. Normally the Guard, you serve 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks in the summer or whenever you're able to do the 2 weeks. But when you're activated or so-called put on orders, then you become active duty again. I'd spent 2 years on active duty right after high school, then signed up for 6 years in the Guard as a way to get back to Tennessee because I didn't like living elsewhere. This is where I belong for sure. But I said, yeah, I'd be happy to. I don't have anything to do this summer. It'd be a great way to serve my country. This sounds like an interesting adventure. And so they said, okay, Sergeant Deaton, we're putting you on orders, you're activated. Came out to the base, went down to the police unit, and went through a 3-day crash course on how to be a military police officer. And during that crash course, I remember very vividly using their FATS machine. FATS stands for Firearms Training Simulator. And the Firearms Training Simulator, the technology is better today, I'm sure, but back then it was a big screen TV. And back over here, maybe 10, 15 feet away, was a police sergeant on a computer. And here I am with another trainee, and we both have not real pistols, but simulated pistols that were gas-driven or air-driven, such that when you squeeze the trigger, it both had a laser on it that would register your shot on the big screen TV. And it also had that air in it, which would cycle the slide to simulate actually pulling the trigger and firing a shot in a semi-automatic pistol. And we went through different scenarios, and depending on how we handled the scenarios and depending on what the police sergeant wanted us to experience and to see how we would react, he would change the scenario. And so I remember one in particular, we went to serve a warrant, and we went to a house and knocked on the door. We told the lady that answered that we're here to see such and such. She said, he's down in the basement. So she led us to the basement. We went down a narrow stairwell. When we got to the bottom, we saw this big hulk of a man wearing a really thin tank top, bench pressing. And he's really moving a lot of weight, and he's doing it in a very violent way. And I say, sir, Sergeant Deaton, we need to speak with you. Could you please put down the weights? Ignores me, does the weights more aggressively and with grunts. Sir, could you please put down the weight? We need to speak with you. We'd appreciate you putting down the weight. The guy ignores me, gets more aggressive with the weight. He finally puts the weight down. He lays there for a moment, looks aggravated. I'm still trying to talk to him. He leans over beside the bench, pulls up a shotgun, and before I can get my hand on my pistol, boom, shoots me and my partner. Now, why would the security forces folks put a poor radio maintenance technician like me, that was my normal work, I was just a radio maintenance technician, through a scenario where somebody in the basement lifting weights shoots me with a shotgun? Well, it's because I was going to be entrusted to check identification at the guard shack. I was going to be standing up there in front of the 119th Air Control Squadron, which today is under Space Command, but back in my day it was the Air Control Squadron, and ensure that no one came up there that weren't supposed to come up there. And so I needed to be prepared with a warrior mindset that anyone that pulls up here really could be an Al-Qaeda recruit. At the time, the best intelligence we had was that the attacks are not over. They're going to attack again. We just don't know when and where. And McGee-Tyson Air Base, being 30-40 minutes from Oak Ridge National Laboratory, could be a target because Oak Ridge is rumored to house nuclear weapons. And so it really could be the case that somebody's going to come up there to the 119th, take over that strategic or that tactical location, which was up on a hill over the primary base, and use that to steal a nuclear weapon or do this or do that. And so I needed to take this job very seriously, and I needed to realize the danger and the threat. That warrior mindset is very much appropriate for military police. However, former police officer turned University of South Carolina law professor Seth Stoughton argues in Law Enforcement's warrior problem that this warrior mindset is counterproductive for civilian police officers. He argues instead for what he calls a guardian paradigm or a guardian mindset, which focuses on collaboration, communication, tactical restraint, rather than hypervigilance, paranoia, control, domineering, etc. The two practical recommendations that he includes that he thinks can best bring about this guardian mindset or this guardian paradigm would be number one, non-enforcement contact, and number two, tactical restraint. I'll explain what these are in just a moment. But first, a few words on the warrior mindset, on the warrior paradigm, and how that may not be appropriate for civilian policing. He says that the attitude of suspicion, caution, resentment, fear, condescension, and manipulation that comes out of this constant focus on the dangers of policing can lead to policing that is more dangerous than it needs to be. He says it makes policing less safe for both officers and civilians. Quote, either through formal training or informal example, officers learn to both verbally and physically control the space they operate in. It is essential to set the proper tone for an encounter, and the tone that best preserves officer safety is widely thought to be one of unquestioned command. He cites an article from 2010 on command presence, which maybe this was a joke, but it was in the article. The author recommended that, quote, you remain humble and compassionate, be professional and courteous, and have a plan to kill everyone you meet. Seems like that's from a movie or something, but apparently it's for this article as well. And Stoughton explains that officers are told that the plan is necessary, officers are told, because everyone they meet may very well have a plan to kill them. This mindset creates a barrier to community policing. It creates a barrier to mutual respect. And as former Sheriff Sue Rahr puts it, we do our recruits, quote, we do our recruits no favor if we train them to approach every situation as a war. To do so sets them up to create unnecessary resistance and risk of injury. And Stoughton points out that half of the 10 most violent and destructive riots that the United States has ever witnessed, and this was written years before the current civil unrest, 5 of the 10 most destructive riots were direct responses to police overreach and police abuse. And so when police are overly aggressive, this can have backlash, not just simply for that particular community, but for the broader community, and in some cases, the entire country. And the call to be more to exercise more restraint isn't new. It's something that was included in a report on policing efforts during the Prohibition era. And the authors of the report said that, look, whenever police are overly aggressive, whenever they show a disregard for respecting citizens' rights and not treating them with appropriate respect, this is going to lead to a backlash. It's going to lead to people not trusting the police. It's going to lead to people not following the law as much as they might otherwise. And so it's counterproductive to be overbearing in your approach. It's counterproductive to have this warrior mindset that treats every encounter as a possible murder, a case where you may be assaulted and your life taken. Now, is that a risk? Sure it's a risk. But if that's what you focus on, if that's what recruits are scared into focusing on when they first join the force, if that's what's repeated, if that's the culture, if that's the mindset, it's going to lead to an unnecessary escalation, argues Stoughton. Now, of course, I wasn't a security forces augmentee long enough, and I didn't have a variety or a diversity of encounters that were thorough enough for me to make any sort of assessment on this from experience. All I did was stand at the gate and check IDs. I got to carry an M16 and do it. It was very good for my assertiveness, but that was the extent of my police work. Is it especially dangerous? It certainly can be, but Stoughton's simply arguing if you treat every person that you interact with, every civilian, as if they might kill you, it's not going to be good for the community, it's not going to be good for policing, including the police officers. Now, that alternative that he argues, the guardian mindset, here's the way he explains it. He says, quote, put simply, the guardian mindset prioritizes service over crime fighting, and it values the dynamics of short-term encounters as a way to create long-term relationships. As a result, it instructs officers that their interactions with community members must be more than legally justified. They must also be empowering, fair, respectful, and considerate. The guardian mindset emphasizes communication over commands, cooperation over compliance, and legitimacy over authority. And in the use of force context, the guardian emphasizes patience and restraint over control, stability over action. Now, those two practical suggestions, again, are non-enforcement contact and tactical restraint. This first one, non-enforcement contact, this is where you simply mingle with the civilian population. And he argues that rookies should do this on devoted days, perhaps every Thursday and Friday, their job isn't to do any sort of enforcement whatsoever. It's simply to go into the community and shake hands, to meet people, to go to barbecues, to walk down the street, to make contacts. He says this is going to develop essential communication skills, indispensable communication skills. And it's also going to build relationships with key people who, when they see they're being treated with respect and interest, may be more likely to assist police, may be more likely to discourage criminal behavior, may be more likely to themselves lead a more law-abiding life. Now maybe that's being naive to think that, but I don't know. If enough officers did that, maybe it really would have a genuine impact on the community. But in any case, he thinks that rookies should do that maybe for a devoted length of time, perhaps their first month, first 2 months, perhaps every Thursday and Friday. And he thinks that this should be both mandatory and recurring over the course of an officer's career. So it wouldn't just be a rookie thing, it'd be something that you would do on a regular basis and a recurring basis to maintain those relationships, to maintain that mutual respect and to develop it. The other approach, other element, is that tactical restraint. Tactical restraint is simply using less force and using your own judgment not to escalate a situation, even when you would be legally justified in escalating a situation. And he offers 3 different examples of where this is already practiced. For example, waiting for backup before initiating an arrest. So you pulled someone over, you know it's the case that they have warrants, you know it's the case you're going to need to take them in. It's standard police procedure, when manpower allows, to wait for backup to arrive before you cuff them. If they're not causing problems otherwise, you wait. And you wait because if you have backup, they're less likely to cause any problems, because that additional officer is going to be a deterrent, because they know if they get physical, they're not just going to have to deal with you, they're going to have to deal with the other person. If they become physical nonetheless, if there are 2 officers there, they can use a much lower level of force to neutralize the situation. If it's just one person, depending on the physical disparities between the 2, the officer may have to escalate from simply using his or her hands to using pepper spray to using a taser. Maybe the assailant goes for their sidearm and they get it out of the holster, and now you've got a lethal confrontation where you're justified in using lethal force, and perhaps you're going to need to use lethal force to save your own life. However, if you simply waited for backup to arrive, now if the confrontation becomes physical, one officer grabs their hands, the other officer takes them to the ground, you put their hands behind their back, you cuff them, and you're done. They still resisted arrest, but it did not escalate, it did not become lethal. And so this is an intelligent usage of tactical restraint. Stoughton's arguing for more of this in other contexts. A second example he uses is a foot chase. He says that police officers are routinely taught that if they're in a foot chase after a suspect, not to apprehend them until backup arrives again. They're taught to keep the suspect in sight, to not let them get away, but to wait until you've got somebody else to apprehend them. He even gives the funny example of an officer that would actually tell suspects if they were running, "Run faster, I've almost caught you. Run faster, I'm almost there." And he would do this because he knew that whenever he finally caught up to them, they would be too tired to put up a fight. Apparently this guy or gal was in good shape, and so they could make them run. Now, Stoughton points out that the officer could not arrest them or give them the additional, they could still arrest them, could not give them the additional charge of resisting arrest because, hey, they were just doing what the officer told them to, which was run. But the officer thought that, hey, this was a great trade-off. I don't have to escalate violence. This is a good way for me to avoid having to fight this person. I get to take them into custody fairly peacefully, and so I'm happy with that. We'll de-escalate the situation and have fewer charges, and that's a good thing. The last instance that he gives an example of is a protest that included vandalism. And if you've been watching television recently, you may have seen some instances like this. I saw on the television just a couple of weeks ago a scene of Lafayette Square, which is right next to the White House, where protests against police violence spurred by the George Floyd murder in Minneapolis, they turned very violent. There were fires there, there were destruction of property, defacing of property. This isn't the example that Stoughton uses, but he uses the example of a similar scenario where officers did not attempt to immediately arrest the vandals, but instead waited for them. They noted who was was actually defacing stuff, who was burning stuff, waited for them to leave, and then in a more secluded area made their arrest. This avoided inciting further violence. It avoided inciting the crowd to become more violent. And so this was tactical restraint. Now, were the officers legally justified? Would they be legally justified in immediately intervening and forcing the situation and forcing the vandals to stop what they're doing, to surrender, to put up their hands? Could they have escalated violence if the protesters and the looters and whatnot did not obey their commands? Of course they could. They could escalate it all the way to lethal use of force. But Stoughton argues that that's unnecessary and that it's an inappropriate role for police officers in a civilian role. Now, you may be thinking, and actual police officers that read this and watch this video may be thinking, my job is just too dangerous to do any of this, Matt. I can't tone it back. I have to maintain control. And this reminds me of a scene from the Waco miniseries, which I just finished watching on Netflix. It's very interesting. I lived through that time period. It was about the Branch Davidians. They were a religious group in Texas that the ATF attempted to raid on firearms charges and also some children's sexual abuse charges. It went horribly wrong. ATF agents were killed, Branch Davidians were killed, and it led to a multiple-day standoff, I think 50 or 60-day standoff. And during the film, you've got a tension between the FBI's lead negotiator, the FBI was called in because ATF had botched it so much, and you've got the lead tactics guy from FBI. And the lead negotiator. The lead negotiator is much more patient. The lead negotiator is interested in ensuring the situation reaches a peaceful resolution. The lead negotiator wants to ensure that the 25 children inside the compound are kept safe. The tactical person, the person who's overseeing the tactical portion, he wants to put more pressure on the Branch Davidians. He wants to use psychological warfare. He wants to use tanks to intimidate, to destroy the vehicles that are parked outside. And eventually, the more aggressive approach wins out. The FBI petitions the Attorney General, Janet Reno, that, hey, we need to go in now with tear gas. There's no other solution. They relieve the lead negotiator of his responsibilities. And there's a scene in the film where the lead negotiator forces the tactical guy to defend his approach. Why are you being so aggressive? It's unnecessary. We can afford to wait. Let's wait. And the lead tactics guy says, are we an organization that coddles cop killers, or are we the FBI? 5,000 to 1. That's the ratio of civilians to law enforcement officers in the United States. And the only way we're able to effectively do our job is through the perception that we are in control. Every day that passes during this standoff, every day that this is broadcast nationwide on television, every day that the Branch Davidians thumb their nose at the mighty FBI is a day that the public loses respect for law enforcement. And we can't afford to let that happen, because to the extent that it does, the more difficult it's going to be to maintain order. That's not the actual words he used, but that was his argument. So a person may have that sort of an objection against this. However, it doesn't mean that you couldn't have both. It could be the case that you've got a balanced guardian mindset that, when appropriate, exercises force, but when tactically appropriate and available, scales back the use of force. And there's a recent article. I don't know this gentleman, but his mother, Priscilla Gregory, she was my high school English teacher way back in the day. And this is Officer Bryant Gregory, and he's a police officer near Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And he made the news recently because there were some protests by peaceful protesters against police violence generally. And Officer Gregory volunteered to sit down with one of the protesters and simply talk about the situation. And there he is on the grass with one of the protesters, and the headline there is MTSU student says he made a friend out of deputy during peaceful protest. And I'll put a link to the article here in the video description. You can check that out. But it's an encouraging, heartwarming story of an officer volunteering to speak to a protester, to listen to their concerns. And what I gather from the article is that a genuine friendship is emerging from this, which could change many lives. People that see this, the other people in the community, this gentleman in particular, this officer in particular, his influence on other officers in the policing culture. So there you go. There's an interesting article and argument to consider. I'm not an actual officer myself, so my first-hand experience is limited, but as always, you decide.